Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I've replayed those first 12 hours in my head countless times, trying to pinpoint exactly when I realized everything had changed forever. It's strange how a routine day can spiral into chaos before you even notice. I've never been the sort of person to keep a journal or record my experiences, but now I feel compelled to share my story, maybe to warn others, or maybe just to make sense of it all myself. My shift at the small veterinary clinic where I work started like any other. I arrived early in the afternoon to check on a few cats that had been brought in for routine surgeries. Our clinic was located on the outskirts of a quiet suburban area, a place where life felt tranquil most of the time. People brought in their pets for vaccines, checkups, and occasionally emergency surgeries, but nothing ever felt truly alarming. That day, the waiting room was calm. My receptionist, Lydia, greeted me with the usual stack of files. One case caught my eye, an older dog that had been found wandering near the edge of town. The note read, "Possible broken leg, in shock, friendly." I had a soft spot for strays. There's something about a scared, homeless animal that always tugged at my heart. I decided to handle that case first. The dog, a mixed breed with a thick coat of charcoal and white fur, looked exhausted. He lay motionless on a blanket in one of our kennels, his eyes half open. At first glance, I thought it might be a standard case of a broken leg combined with dehydration. I knelt down to offer a hand for him to sniff, speaking in a quiet voice to put him at ease. My veterinary assistant, Elena, stood behind me. She asked if I needed help taking the dog's vitals, so we methodically went through the standard steps: temperature, heart rate, respirations. Everything was more or less stable, though a bit on the lower end of normal. I noted a few minor scratches on his muzzle, which suggested he might have been in a scuffle. It was nothing urgent, or so I thought. About an hour later, Lydia rushed into the examination area, eyes wide. She said that someone else had just brought in a dog with a strange bite wound. Apparently, the Good Samaritan who delivered this second dog mentioned it had been attacked by a neighborhood pet that had started acting odd. At the time, we didn't connect the dots. We just assumed it was another routine case of an animal fight. This new arrival was a medium-sized terrier. It had a bite mark on its flank that looked deep but not catastrophic. I immediately wanted to clean and bandage it, but I noticed the dog was trembling more than what I'd expect from ordinary fear or pain. Its eyes seemed unfocused. When I tried to listen to its heart, I heard a rapid, erratic beat, something that didn't match any infection or shock I'd come across before. I stabilized the terrier as best I could. We gave it fluids and took a few quick samples to send out for testing. Then I went back to check on the stray with the broken leg, only to find him pacing in his kennel, lips curled back as though in a quiet snarl. Dogs in pain can act aggressively, of course, but this was different. His eyes followed me in a way that made my stomach twist with unease. Elena joined me, stepping carefully toward the kennel to see if the dog would let her approach. As soon as she got within reach, it lunged, snapping at the metal bars. The look of confusion on Elena's face said it all. The dog had been lethargic and gentle before. Now it was like a switch had flipped. I told Elena to keep her distance and secure the kennel. My plan was to sedate the dog if necessary, but I also wanted to observe a bit longer to understand what was happening. The unpredictability set me on edge. About half an hour later, Lydia received a phone call from a frantic client. She signaled me from the front desk to pick up the extension. The client's voice shook with panic as she explained that her cat had been attacked by a raccoon in broad daylight. The raccoon acted unusual, pacing in circles and drooling before lunging at her pet. Could she bring the cat in immediately? We told her yes, of course, and to be careful. My mind buzzed with a dozen possible explanations: rabies, parasites, or some environmental factor. But something told me this was bigger than a few isolated incidents. The scenario sounded too similar, animals turning erratic and hyper-aggressive in a short span of time. That suspicion intensified when my phone pinged with text messages from some friends in town. They wrote about people receiving strange bites from infected animals. A local news alert mentioned a viral outbreak that was still under investigation. Some people were calling it severe rabies. Others mentioned the word zombie, but I dismissed that as sensationalism. I'm a scientist at heart. I rely on data and facts. Yet, even in those early moments, a small voice in the back of my head whispered that the world might be on the brink of something unimaginable. Late in the afternoon, the clinic started feeling like a storm was brewing. The terrier with the bite wound became more restless, whining and scratching at its cage door. The broken leg stray alternated between lying completely still and thrashing violently against the kennel. Both dogs seemed to deteriorate in unpredictable cycles. Then, a new and terrifying development occurred. Elena was checking on the terrier when it suddenly lunged at her hand through the cage bars. She jerked back just in time, avoiding a full bite, but the dog managed to snag her wrist, leaving a shallow scratch from its teeth. It wasn't a deep wound, but Elena looked shaken. I washed the area thoroughly, applied disinfectant and bandaged her. Still, something about her demeanor worried me. She seemed dazed, almost in shock, even though the injury was minor. I urged her to sit down, drink some water, and stay calm. She nodded, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. I called the closest hospital to report a possible exposure, but my call didn't go through. Lines were busy, or maybe the system was already overloaded. That was the first moment I genuinely felt cut off from the rest of the world. As evening approached, the city put out an emergency alert on the radio and local TV channels. They urged everyone to stay indoors and avoid contact with any animals acting strangely. They also mentioned that local authorities were trying to contain a fast-spreading illness. The message used measured language, nothing outright alarming, but the tone of the reporter's voice told me that the situation was more dire than the script implied. I told Lydia to lock our main entrance. No more walk-ins. We already had 4 animals in the clinic that day, and 3 of them showed concerning behavior. The cat that arrived after the raccoon attack was no better, panting, drooling, and staring with glazed eyes. It had scratched one of our newer assistants, Marcus, when he tried to examine it. I thought about sending everyone home, but that felt irresponsible. If this was some sort of viral emergency, it might not be safe to travel. It also felt wrong to leave the animals alone, especially if some were ill or injured. After a brief huddle, we decided to stay put, at least for a while, and try to keep things contained. We had adequate medical supplies for both animals and humans, which might help us if the outside world was truly in chaos. Around 8 p.m., Elena's condition worsened. She was pale and complained of a splitting headache. She kept rubbing her arms as though she was extremely cold, even though the clinic temperature was normal. I set her up on a makeshift cot in the back office near the storage closet. I wanted to monitor her vitals. Her temperature was higher than normal, and her pulse was alarmingly rapid. Meanwhile, the terrier's whines intensified. I walked into the kennel area to find the dog scratching at the door, paw pads nearly raw. One detail caught my eye that made my stomach drop. The terrier's gums appeared discolored, as though there was poor circulation. Normally, we see pink or pale gums in sick dogs, but these had a greyish hue. Suddenly, the dog stopped whining and went eerily still. Then it locked eyes with me through the bars and let out a low, guttural sound I'd never heard from a canine in all my years of practice. The hair on my arms stood up. This wasn't normal aggression. It was as if the dog was operating on an entirely different, primal level of behavior. I tried to remain calm. I kept repeating to myself that it must be some form of severe infection that causes neurological symptoms, but even that didn't fully add up. Everything was happening too quickly. I'd never seen anything like it. By 9 p.m., we decided to check on the stray with the broken leg. Lydia and I approached his kennel cautiously. The dog lay on its side, breathing in shallow rasps. I thought he might have passed away during one of his thrashing episodes. I carefully opened the kennel door, taking every precaution. Thick gloves, sedation syringe ready, just in case he was still a threat. As soon as we were close enough, the dog's eyes snapped open. It lunged at Lydia's arm with surprising speed, given its earlier state of near unconsciousness. I managed to push Lydia aside just in time. The dog hit the floor of the kennel, then scrambled up against the wall, teeth bared. Its pupils were unnaturally dilated. Thick drool hung from its muzzle. Despite my growing horror, I tried to give it a sedative injection. I wanted to run tests or at least keep it calm. But the moment I moved closer, it snapped at the needle, forcing me back. Lydia and I retreated, heartbeats pounding in our ears. I noticed something else alarming. The dog's injured leg no longer seemed to bother it. The fracture that had been clear on the X-ray that afternoon was now supporting weight with minimal sign of pain. It made no sense. Injuries don't just vanish in a matter of hours. But that's what I was witnessing. During a lull in the chaos, I checked my phone for messages. Social media was exploding with rumors of an outbreak. Some people posted videos of bite victims wandering streets, disoriented and aggressive. The word zombie popped up more frequently, though I still refused to believe it was literal. It had to be a severe medical condition, something that doctors simply hadn't identified yet. A local news outlet posted a short video clip from a nearby hospital. In the background, I saw people lying on stretchers, strapped down, while nurses hustled in protective suits. The camera was shaky, but it captured enough to fill me with dread. A glimpse of patients with wild eyes, trying to break free from their restraints. My mind raced, wondering if Elena's condition would follow the same trajectory. She'd only been scratched, but if even a small wound could transmit whatever this was. I dashed to the back office to check on her. She was asleep, though her breathing was shallow. Her face was flushed, and sweat glistened on her forehead. I tried waking her gently, but she barely stirred. I decided to give her some fluids and a cold compress for her fever. I made a mental note that if things got worse, I might have to isolate her. In the kennels, the cat attacked by the raccoon was growing more erratic. Marcus reported that it kept lunging at the door of its carrier. Every time we tried to approach, it hissed and swiped at us. It was impossible to administer any medication. Stray flecks of foam clung to its mouth, another sign that something was critically wrong. The idea of euthanizing these animals to prevent further spread crossed my mind, but ethically, it felt like a last resort. I wanted answers first. Besides, part of me still held out hope that there was a chance to treat them. If it was viral, maybe we could develop or find an antiviral medication. But deep down, I knew we didn't have that luxury of time. By 10 p.m., I gathered the staff, Lydia, Marcus, and a junior tech named Jason, at the reception desk. We needed a plan. We discussed barricading the kennel area to keep the infected animals separated. We also considered trying to isolate Elena until we knew more about her condition. Lydia brought up the local emergency broadcast, which urged everyone to remain where they were and to secure buildings from intruders, human or otherwise. The broadcast repeated the phrase, "Use extreme caution when dealing with individuals or animals displaying aggressive behavior." We ended our brief huddle with the decision to lock down the clinic. We pushed furniture against the doors and did our best to seal any windows with plywood we found in the storage room. The building had a sturdy design, but I wasn't sure how it would hold up if more infected creatures started converging here. I checked on Elena again around 10:30 p.m. She was awake, but disoriented. She clutched at her bandaged arm, muttering something under her breath. When I placed a hand on her forehead, she recoiled, as if my touch caused her intense pain. Her eyes darted around, unfocused. I could tell her fever was higher than before. Suddenly, she let out a low moan and struggled to stand. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to calm her. She didn't answer, just stared at me with an expression that bordered on panic and anger at the same time. Then she lurched forward, almost as if she wanted to push past me. I gently guided her back onto the cot. She tried to resist, fingers digging into my arms with surprising strength. "It's all right," I whispered. We'll figure this out." She blinked, as if trying to recognize me, then mumbled words I couldn't quite understand. My heart pounded. I grabbed some medical tape to secure her IV. My hands shook the entire time. If Elena was following the same path as the animals, I brushed that thought aside. I had to focus on immediate steps, keeping her stable, keeping her hydrated, and making sure she didn't hurt herself or anyone else. At 11 p.m., a commotion erupted from the kennel area. A series of loud bangs echoed through the hallway, followed by a chilling growl. Jason came running, shouting that the stray with the broken leg had broken out of its kennel. My stomach sank. I grabbed the sedation kit, though I suspected it might be useless if the dog was truly in a frenzied state. We arrived at the kennel area to find the metal door to the dog's enclosure bent outward. The stray was nowhere in sight. The terrier in the adjacent cage was also strangely silent. As we crept down the hall, we spotted the terrier lying on its side. Its chest wasn't moving. I feared it was gone. Marcus and I approached carefully. The terrier's eyes were open, but they didn't track us. I reached out, half expecting it to snap at my hand, but there was no reaction. It was completely still. I pressed 2 fingers lightly against its neck, checking for a pulse. Nothing. Before we could process the terrier's sudden passing, a low growl came from behind us. Whirling around, I saw the stray crouched at the far end of the kennel corridor, its body tense, gaze locked on us. I swallowed hard. The dog's stance was predatory. Marcus raised his hands, trying to show he meant no harm. I took a step forward, sedation syringe in hand, though I doubted I'd be able to deliver it without being attacked. The dog inched closer, teeth bared. My mind raced with possible tactics, but then something made the dog's ears perk. It turned sharply and darted away through a side door that led to our outdoor exercise pen. A few seconds later, we heard a crash. The dog must have slammed into the chain-link fence. In the darkness, it became a silhouette of snapping jaws and frenzied movement. We needed to secure that exit, or the dog might escape into the neighborhood. But it was strong. Stronger than it should have been with a broken leg. I began to wonder if the virus not only caused aggression, but altered basic physiology. Without hesitation, Jason and I scrambled to block the exit with whatever we could find. Just as we started pushing equipment carts against the doorway, we heard a howl. The stray burst through the chain-link fence, twisting the metal as if it was made of soft wire. In a split second, it was gone, fleeing into the night. The stray's escape changed everything. If it was infected, it could spread this sickness to animals or even people outside our clinic. I felt a crushing sense of responsibility. Should I have euthanized it when I had the chance? My entire career revolved around saving animals, but now we were dealing with a situation where those same animals could endanger countless lives. Then I glanced at the row of cages still housing the cat and a couple of other animals that had come in for minor procedures. Each looked anxious, pawing or meowing softly. They didn't appear infected, but how could I be certain? If the outbreak was this contagious, any one of them could start showing symptoms at any moment. And if we left them locked up, they'd be sitting targets if something else broke in or if conditions worsened. In a trembling voice, I brought up the idea of releasing the healthy animals. Marcus looked at me as though I'd lost my mind. "But what if they get infected out there?" he asked. Lydia countered, "And what if they starve in here if no one can take care of them?" My instincts told me that trying to contain a handful of potentially uninfected pets was less important than making sure we, human and animal, had a fighting chance. After a tense debate, we decided to release the clearly healthy animals into the fenced-in backlot. We figured they'd at least be able to escape if something worse happened inside the clinic. It was a desperate plan, but none of us saw a better alternative. Midnight approached, and the atmosphere in the clinic was suffocating. The only lights left were our emergency bulbs and a few headlamps we kept for nighttime checks. The city outside was eerily silent, except for the occasional sound of sirens or distant crashes. I wondered how widespread the outbreak had become. Lydia and Jason helped me guide 2 healthy dogs and a recovering cat toward the back exit. We opened the door to the fenced area, letting them out. They appeared wary but quickly moved away, as if sensing the tension in the air. Suddenly, a thud echoed down the hall. Marcus shouted for help, his voice tinged with terror. We raced toward the source of the noise to find Elena standing in the hallway, swaying unsteadily. She had gotten up from her cot. Her eyes looked glazed, and a dark streak ran down her chin. At first, I thought it was sweat or saliva, but then I realized it was something else, something that made my heart pound with dread. Marcus was on the floor holding his arm. "She attacked me," he said in a trembling voice. She just lunged. Elena's gaze darted around, settling on us. In a flash, she charged, letting out a guttural sound. She moved with a strength and speed that didn't match her usual self. Jason managed to sidestep her, but I felt her shoulder slam into me as she passed, knocking me against the wall. We all kept shouting Elena's name, pleading with her to recognize us, but there was no response that indicated she understood. She stumbled, grabbing at a table for support, then let out another awful growl. Marcus tried to restrain her gently, but she flailed, scratching at his face. In the chaos, it became clear that she was experiencing the same aggression we'd seen in the animals. My stomach twisted. Elena, my trusted assistant and friend, was now another casualty of this devastating outbreak. We had no choice but to secure Elena for her safety and ours. Jason ran for medical restraints. We tried to corner her near the supply shelves. She fought us with a frenzied energy, making strange guttural sounds. Eventually, we managed to pin her arms long enough to fasten the restraints. Tears blurred my vision as I realized the reality of our situation. Elena needed help we couldn't provide. We carried her, gently but firmly, back to the office where we set up another cot. I tried to speak to her in soothing tones, but she just stared at the ceiling, occasionally emitting low moans. Marcus watched from the doorway, his face pale. He clutched his injured arm, which I now had to disinfect. We were running dangerously low on supplies. As I bandaged Marcus's wound, I felt the weight of the entire night crushing me. My mind drifted to that first dog with the broken leg, which had unleashed this havoc in our clinic. Yet, as horrifying as our situation was, a more pressing concern lurked in the back of my thoughts. The outbreak beyond these walls must be exponentially worse. By 1 a.m., phone lines were down, or at least jammed. The internet connection was spotty. Lydia managed to get a short message out to her husband, telling him to shelter in place. Then our service cut off completely. In the distance, we could hear sporadic screams and the sounds of cars speeding through the streets. Helicopters flew overhead, their searchlights sweeping across the neighborhood. The local emergency broadcast repeated the same urgent advisory. Remain indoors, secure all entry points, do not approach anyone acting erratically. If you have been bitten or scratched, seek medical attention immediately. I looked at Elena, unconscious now, her body bound in soft restraints on the cot. We couldn't bring her to a hospital. Even if we tried, we'd be risking our lives out on the streets. And something inside me suspected that medical facilities were already overwhelmed. Marcus asked the question none of us wanted to face. What if the infected people don't get better? What if they end up like those videos online? His voice trembled. He didn't say the word zombie, but we all understood the reference. Up until that point, I had been clinging to the hope that there might be a cure, or at least a treatment. But as the night wore on, that hope felt increasingly fragile. We huddled again, this time by lantern light, discussing our next move. We knew we couldn't hold out indefinitely. Supplies would run low, and the clinic wasn't designed as a fortress. The logical option was to try to get to a larger medical facility or a designated evacuation center. But if we left, we'd be abandoning Elena, and I wasn't ready to do that. Eventually, we settled on waiting until morning. If the situation outside looked manageable, we would attempt to leave in my van, taking Elena with us. If not, we'd continue to barricade ourselves inside. I tried to reassure everyone that help would eventually arrive. yet in my heart I doubted it. The hours between 1 a.m. and sunrise stretched endlessly. Every small sound outside made me tense, expecting something, or someone, to break down our doors. We took turns checking on the remaining animals. The cat infected by the raccoon had gone silent, lying motionless in its carrier. I wasn't sure if it was alive or not, and couldn't bring myself to open the carrier to find out. I caught brief moments of rest in an office chair, my eyes snapping open at the slightest noise. A part of me hoped to wake up from a bad dream, but the bright emergency lantern made it all too real. Marcus dozed on a couch in the reception area, his arm bandaged tightly, while Lydia paced the corridors, unable to settle. By the time the sky lightened around 6 a.m., we felt a tiny surge of relief. Morning would bring clarity. We looked out the windows, which were still partially barricaded, but gave us a sliver of view. Smoke rose in the distance, and the streets appeared deserted. No pedestrians, no cars, just eerie stillness. We decided to do a quick perimeter check outside. Armed with makeshift protection, broom handles, wooden boards, we stepped into the morning light. The air carried a stagnant hush, broken only by the sound of crows circling overhead. In the back lot, the healthy animals we had released were gone, their tracks leading under a bent portion of the fence. I hoped they had found safer ground, though I couldn't shake the worry that they might be roaming around, at risk of encountering the infected. Then, we noticed something near the clinic's main entrance. A smear of dark fluid, and the distinct indentation of a dog's paw in the dirt. My stomach churned. It might have been the stray that escaped. If it returned during the night, maybe it had tried to get back in. The idea that this infected animal could roam free haunted me. Inside, Elena's condition hadn't improved. She remained restrained, conscious but unresponsive. Sometimes she'd let out soft moans, turning her head toward us with an expression that bordered on vacant. We tried offering water, but she refused. Her body temperature was alarmingly high. At one point, she mustered enough strength to strain against the straps, but soon sank back into silence. I kept checking my phone, but there was still no signal. Lydia managed to get a battery-powered radio working. The voice of an emergency coordinator crackled through the static, providing instructions for survival groups. They emphasized traveling in groups, avoiding congested areas, and only moving during daylight hours if possible. They also mentioned that many roads were blocked by abandoned cars and accidents. After a brief talk, we agreed to take our chances. Staying in the clinic felt like a ticking clock, especially with Elena's health declining. If we left early, we might have enough daylight to reach an emergency shelter or hospital. We gathered what medical supplies we could carry, as well as some canned food and water from the staff lounge. Carefully, we guided Elena into a rolling office chair. She was too weak to walk steadily, but still possessed unpredictable bursts of energy. As we moved toward the exit, I hesitated, glancing back at the clinic. This had been my second home for years, a place dedicated to healing animals. Now it was a makeshift fortress against an unimaginable threat. The animals that remained were beyond our help. Most were infected or had already passed. Letting them go the night before had been an act of mercy, but part of me felt guilty. Had I made it worse by letting them run free? I shook off that thought. We needed to focus on survival now. Stepping outside into the early morning sun felt surreal. The streets, normally bustling with joggers, dog walkers, and kids on bikes, were silent. Cars sat abandoned at odd angles. Several storefront windows were smashed, though it was unclear whether that was from people looting or simply the chaos of the outbreak. We loaded Elena into my van as gently as we could. Marcus sat with her in the back, keeping an eye on her restraints. Lydia sat up front with me. Before driving off, I paused for one last look at the clinic building. My heart clenched with the weight of loss and uncertainty. We drove slowly, navigating around debris and occasional piles of overturned trash cans. A few blocks away, we saw shapes moving between houses. They could have been animals or people. We didn't stop to investigate. If they were infected, we wanted no part of it. At one intersection, a distant figure flagged us down. Lydia and I exchanged uncertain glances. We were torn between compassion and self-preservation. Ultimately, we stopped, though I kept the engine running. The person limped toward us, one arm in a makeshift sling. His eyes looked clear, not clouded with aggression. Through the open window, he pleaded for a ride to a local emergency shelter that he claimed was set up at a high school a few miles away. We let him in, though we were on edge. He introduced himself as Robert, a teacher who had been caught outside when people started turning aggressive. He talked about the outbreak as if it had happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, the town was normal. The next, it was a nightmare. We asked if he had any bites or scratches, and he swore he didn't. Still, we remained cautious, not knowing how else this infection might spread. We followed Robert's directions to the high school. Along the way, we saw more signs of chaos: broken glass, shattered fences, a few wandering figures who stared blankly at the van as we passed. At least they weren't trying to force their way in, yet. When we arrived, a group of people with anxious faces waved us into the parking lot. The scene looked disorganized. Cars parked haphazardly, families clinging to each other. A makeshift barricade of metal trash cans and wooden boards surrounded one of the gym entrances. We spotted men in reflective vests trying to coordinate, but it was clear they were overwhelmed. Marcus and I carefully unloaded Elena, explaining to the volunteers that she might be infected. They gave us uncertain looks but didn't turn us away. Instead, they guided us to a quarantine area set up in a side hallway. I felt a twinge of hope, foolish though it might be. At least we weren't alone anymore. The next few minutes blurred as we handed Elena over to a small medical team. Lydia and I clung to each other, exhausted. Robert disappeared into the crowd, presumably searching for other survivors he might know. Marcus looked haunted by the memory of Elena attacking him. I wanted to comfort him, but I had no words. A volunteer asked us to fill out forms detailing what we knew of the outbreak, including symptoms and transmission. I gave them as much information as I could, from the first dog that arrived at the clinic to the terrifying changes we observed in Elena. They listened intently, scribbling notes. One of them mentioned that multiple shelters across the city were running out of space and supplies. The infection rate was staggering. As we settled into an empty corner of the gym, the events of the last 12 hours finally caught up to me. My clinic, my patients, and my colleague Elena. It felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Sleep was impossible, even though every muscle in my body cried out for rest. The overhead lights in the gym buzzed, and anxious conversations hummed everywhere. I realized I was among a fortunate few who survived that initial wave. But the guilt lingered. I had wanted to protect the animals under my care. In doing so, I might have unleashed the virus even further. The image of that stray dog bending chain-link fencing with supernatural strength haunted me. How many more animals out there had the same infection? And how many people would they infect? Yet amid the horror, a single thought kept me going. Maybe by sharing what we witnessed, we could help someone else prepare and protect themselves. If this account reaches anyone, if you're hearing or reading these words, learn from our mistakes. Do what you must to stay safe. The infection moves fast, and early signs can be subtle. A scratch or a minor bite is all it takes. Above all, if someone you care about shows symptoms, you have to act immediately to keep everyone safe. I still cling to hope. If we could survive those first 12 hours, maybe we can outlast the storm. There might be a cure or a vaccine in the future. But for now, all we can do is stay vigilant, protect each other, and remember that compassion sometimes means making impossible choices. My only advice, if you ever find yourself in a similar position, is this: trust your instincts, keep a clear head, and never underestimate the severity of a seemingly small threat. My name is Dr. Conway, and I'm a veterinarian. I lived through the first 12 hours of the zombie outbreak. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I survived this far, and I'll keep fighting for as long as I can. Thank you for listening. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps this channel alive. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember, curiosity can be quite the companion, and sometimes a curse.